Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Before we get into today's video, I just want to give a shout out and a big congratulations to Ryan and Tanya, aka Northern Perspective. As of recording this video, they're just about to hit 100,000 subscribers. I'm sure once I release it, they're already going to be there. So yeah, just a big congratulations. It's great seeing a lot more Canadian content creators on the platform growing, especially ones that talk about politics. And you guys do a fantastic job informing the Canadian people about what's going on. You do great research, and I'm sure once that plaque comes in, it's going to look fantastic behind you guys in future videos. So again, congratulations, great milestone to hit. With all that being said, in regards to today's video, as I mentioned last week, the House of Commons on Friday is typically a little bit different. It is at an earlier time, but it's also typically a smaller house. There's not a lot of people, a lot more of the backbenchers will stand up and talk. And if you did tune into the question period on Friday, right before it started, the Conservative member Rick Perkins stood up for about 10 to 12 minutes giving a point of privilege speech. And he was talking about the biggest scandal that the Liberal Party is involved in, almost $1 billion, if not more, in taxpayer money going to corrupt individuals. So without further ado, just take a listen to what he's saying.
And I think we can move on to the next speaker in debate. The chair recognizes the honourable member for South Shore, St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to deal with the ruling of the Speaker with regard to the production of documents ordered by this House on the scandal involving Sustainable Development Technologies Canada, otherwise known as the Liberal billion-dollar Green Slush Fund. The process for those watching was that the House ordered the production of these documents around the scandal to the law clerk, which could then be transferred to the RCMP for investigation. As we know, the power of the House is greater than any one act, yet the Prime Minister's personal department, the PCO, decided to execute this order by telling departments to send in documents but redact them. As a result, that was, in our view, and obviously in the Speaker's view, a breach of members' privileges because the order from the House did not say redact.
Now, if you've been following this whole scandal at all, you've known that this has been an issue since May and June of last year. Last November, this was brought up to Minister Champlain about the redactions. He cited some sort of health and safety for the people mentioned in it.
All right. I will talk about your department now. Our committee asked for a document that was unredacted from Raymond Chabot, Grant Thornton, and we received a redacted document. I think that they're avoiding their commitments. I understand the requirements of protecting privacy, but in this case, a redaction like this stops me from understanding the core of the issue. And there are less aggressive ways of anonymizing reports. And this is not a bad judgment here. I want to understand what happened, and the report doesn't allow me to do so. I am for transparency. There was a matter of health and safety for employees that were threatened.
However, just last week, the whistleblower returned, was questioned again on his testimony or when he submitted his documentation as of last year. And he even stated that in reality, there shouldn't be any redactions because this was done by a third-party company doing an investigation. They have no obligation to do these things.
You know, I know the federal government, like the minister, has continued saying that there was no criminal intent and nothing was found, but I think the committee would agree that they're not to be trusted on the situation. I would happily agree to whatever the findings are by the RCMP, but I would say that I wouldn't trust that there isn't any criminality unless the RCMP is given full authority to investigate, because unlike the Auditor General and the sorts of requirements they have for an investigation, the McCarthy Tetro, the RCGT, was not legally binding. It wasn't obligating SDTC, the board members, or anyone else to actually provide some sort of, consent or waiver that obligates them to tell the truth. So again, if you bring in the RCMP and they do their investigation and they find something or they don't, I think the public would be happy with that, but I don't think we should leave it to the current federal government or the ruling party to make those decisions, because let the public see what's there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with this gentleman, but let's move back to Perkins and listen to the rest of what he has to say.
As a result, we're here to discuss this today, and it's been referred to the PROC committee for further consideration. So in doing this, it's pretty important to understand there's some objections from the government, as there has been, about some alleged breach of the charter. Well, there is no breach of the charter, and here's why.
Now, before we let Perkins continue, I find this absolutely rich and ridiculous that the Liberals are trying to talk about the Charter of Rights for Canadians and protecting them, when looking at their track record, they could care less. The trucker convoy, COVID, some of the bills that they're trying to put forward, like Bill C-63, like, these guys have no place to talk about it, yet Karina Gould decided to continuously use this as a talking point, even though the speaker had already approved of this motion, and a Conservative member even called her out on that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And while the colleagues on the opposite side laugh about interfering with police work, it's actually a very serious matter, Mr. Speaker, and there is a very good reason why there is a separation between the legislative branch of government and the judicial branch of government. And what the Conservatives are putting forward is absolutely trying to interfere with that separation and that independence. That is extremely concerning to me, and I think all members should be concerned. And I would ask my honourable colleagues, when they go home tonight, to look themselves in the mirror and to ask whether they are comfortable with the fact that they are setting a new precedent in which this chamber has decided that they should override the rights of Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question commentaire, the honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's unbelievable to me that the government House Leader got up and is worried about charter rights and freedoms when this government's violated every single charter right there is. Freedom of expression with C-11 and C-63, the mobility rights of millions of Canadians, life and security of the person. I could go on and on. And then she says she's concerned to make sure there's separation with the RCMP. When has the RCMP been separated from this government? In the We Charity scandal, when the Prime Minister took an action that benefited him, his wife, and his brother, and his mother, which is against 119(1) of the Criminal Code. What about SNC-Lavalin? When did they start taking action? 4 years after the event? So how can she look herself in the mirror and not see the problem on that side?
Yeah.
Like, the Liberals literally think we're all stupid and we just have our head in the sand. We don't remember or don't see any of the things that they're doing. But just listen to the rest of Perkins here. He's going to start bringing up some crazy numbers that are going to shock you.
If a criminal activity is suspected in a company you own, say a bank, you're part of a bank management team, and you discover that somebody who works for you has stolen the money of depositors, that company has the right, indeed it has the obligation, to call in the police and to turn those documents over to the police. It does not require the police to go to court to get access to those documents. That owner of that company, that management team, can supply those documents to the police to start the investigation. Why does that matter with regard to this instance? We have a foundation that was set up in 2001 called Sustainable Development Technology Canada with the purpose of providing taxpayer financial assistance to green technology companies before they're commercialized. Since this government has been elected, they've received $1 billion of taxpayer money. And the result of that, and probing by parliamentary committees, is that we found that in 82% of the funding transactions approved by the board of directors during a sample period, a 5-year period that the Auditor General looked at, 82% of those transactions were conflicted. So that's a number. What does that mean? According to the Auditor General, that's $330 million of taxpayer money that was given to companies where the board members who voted to give it to those companies, had a conflict of interest. In addition, the Auditor General found that that same board approved another $59 million of projects that they weren't authorized to do. They were outside of the mandate of the foundation that the government and Parliament set up. They broke the SDTC contribution agreements, and these directors broke the conflict of interest laws of Canada as public office holders, and they broke the SDTC Act. So how did they break them? What does that act say? Those two acts say. You know what they say? They say that a governor and council appointment, a person appointed by the government, entrusted to oversee taxpayer money, is not to personally profit from their work on that committee as a GIC appointment, and neither is their family. Yet that's exactly what happened. It's exactly what happened. And the Auditor General found in a 5-year period where there were 405 transactions approved by the board, the Auditor General sampled 226, so only half of them, and found that 186 of those 226 transactions were conflicted. That's the 82%. That's the $330 million. If the Auditor General looked at all 400 transactions, statistically, that would probably mean the rest are just as conflicted. And that 400 transactions is $832 million of taxpayer money.
And so after hearing that statement, it's no wonder that the Liberals' PCO or Privy Council officer decided to ask for a lot of these things to be redacted. Because if what Perkins is saying is true and the Auditor General's numbers are correct, at her taking half the sample size and finding them at 82%, if she applied that exponentially to the whole piece of the pie, let's say, 82% of those transactions most likely are also at a conflict of interest. And if $1 billion of taxpayer money has gone to this organization at 82%, yeah, that's almost $830 million, as Perkins stated. So this is not looking good for the Liberals. And I can bet you that a lot more Liberals are involved in this scandal than let's let on, because when I was listening back to the testimony of the witness from just last week, during one of their questions towards the witness about the third-party investigation with McCarthy, if you have a pair of headphones on, you can actually hear in the audio Liberal MP Jean Yip, when the answer is not going the way that she's wanting it to, she whispers to her colleague, "Don't allow him to do this," and another one says, "I know."
If you read what the McCarthy Tetro disclaimer says, it says that none of the testimony is to actually be relied on from any of the employees. When employees within SDTC or outside were asking to have their NDAs removed, that actually went directly to the executives. So employees who were inside SDTC were actually named, and executives who shouldn't have known that they were actually asking to speak were then actually, like, their identities were released by McCarthy. How do you expect anything truthful to happen when McCarthy effectively released the names of every current and former employee to the same executives that they are trying to, bring some transparency against?
Now again, you don't have to take my word for this. Just replay that section, listen really, really carefully, and you will definitely hear what I heard. And Perkins doesn't stop there. He continues, and you're going to find out some more MPs or ministers that are actually involved in this.
So these Liberal hand-picked appointees of the Prime Minister from the chair on got themselves into a position to benefit their own companies. So how did they do that, and what were their conflicts? Every transaction, every bit of money approved by the $1 billion Green Slush Fund, every single dollar had to be approved by the board of directors. And the way the system worked was that beforehand, they would send out a note of what transactions were on the board, and directors would declare a conflict. So at the beginning of every board meeting, they'd say, here's the list of transactions we're considering. Here's the list of which directors are conflicted with which companies. So now let's go to work. And in some cases, the director would stay in the room, according to the minutes, while they were voting on their own project. In other cases, the director would get up and leave the room while they voted on it, and then that director would come back into the room, and the next director would get out of the room for their project. A nice little tidy conspiracy of conflict of interest to enrich themselves and the values of their companies. One director in particular was particularly aggressive at this. Appointed in 2016 by the Prime Minister, her name's Andrée-Lise Méthode. She runs a venture capital firm called Cycle Capital and Green Technology. And Andrée-Lise Méthode, her companies before and during her time on the board received $250 million. That one director, her companies received $250 million in grants from SDTC. Now, some of that was before, and I'll talk about that before in a minute, but while she was on the board, 114 million went to companies, green companies that she had invested in. And during her time on the board, the value of her company, Cycle Capital, tripled. Because getting an SDTC grant is a stamp of Government of Canada approval, which allowed those companies to raise other funds.
And everything Perkins is saying is verifiable from the whistleblower that came into committee last week, where he himself outed or singled out Andrée-Lise as one of the people that benefited, as well as her company getting this systematic tripling by subsidizing all these different companies.
What funding streams violated the contribution agreement between Sustainable Development Technology Canada and the government?
All of them. The seed funding stream, the ecosystem funding stream, the startup funding stream, and the scaled funding stream. I would mention that every single one of the seed funding projects did not meet any of the requirements, as did none of the ecosystem projects.
How much money passed through those streams?
I think it was over $50 million at least, but I think from the major findings it has to be over $100 million.
Were many of the companies getting funding through these ineligible streams conflicted and connected to political appointees, Liberal appointed board members?
I would assume so. I think anyone who would be appointed through the GIC process would effectively be appointed by the Liberal Party.
Are you aware of any new contribution agreements being made since the Auditor General report came out?
There has been an updated contribution agreement which now effectively goes back and retroactively allows for the majority of those ineligible projects to be considered eligible.
So companies that were in conflicts before or ineligible, they've retroactively made them eligible?
Through the update to the contribution agreement, yes, they would be considered eligible.
That seems highly inappropriate, to say the least. Which of the Liberal-appointed board members benefited the most from what we know to be $330 million tax dollars given out in identified conflicts of interest?
I would say the one that was most benefiting was Andrée-Lise Méthode, because for her, like, she worked at Cycle Capital and she had multiple companies within the SDTC portfolio. So for her, it wasn't a simple one company situation like Annette Verscher. And for Andrée-Lise, you know, she was very friendly with the CEO at SDTC, and there were multiple instances where it wasn't just that she got preferential treatment for projects. She was getting funding 2 or 3 times where, you know, your project gets funding and it's technically graduated, and then it would come back into the fund and get an additional round of funding, and it might happen a 3rd time. So SDTC was effectively subsidizing companies for certain board members for years and years.
So you hear all that, and now you realize why the Privy Council officer for the Liberals decided to get all that information redacted. But as you were listening to the witness and he mentioned Cycle Capital, Perkins here, he's going to tell you who the actual lobbyist for Cycle Capital was for about 10 years. And it might surprise you, it might not.
You'll never guess who her lobbyist was. Any guesses? Any guesses who her lobbyist was? Her in-house paid lobbyist for 10 years before he was elected? The current radical Minister of the Environment. Wow. While he was lobbying for Cycle Capital, the current radical Minister of the Environment got $111 million. And not only that, that minister lobbied, according to the Lobbyist Registration Act, lobbied the Prime Minister's office and the Industry Department 25 times. 25 times in the year before he was elected. And guess what? For all his hard work, he owns shares in Cycle Capital, and he still owns those shares. He's not answered how much the value of those shares have gone up since they've been granted and since that company got this kind of support.
What? Really? You mean the Liberal government isn't being transparent like it said it was going to be? That's mind-blowing. I would have never imagined that he wouldn't disclose that information. I mean, one could guess that as the company has gone triple, his stock and investment probably has tripled as well. But I digress. Let's continue.
But if that wasn't bad enough, this particular director in 2022 left and went to the Canada Infrastructure Bank Board. And what's the first thing that she did at the Canada Infrastructure Bank Board? Voted $170 million of infrastructure bank money for a company owned by the chair of the Green Slush Fund, Annette Verschuren. Now, Annette Verschuren also sought $6 million for the Verschuren Center at Cape Breton Center, at the Verschuren Center at Cape Breton University, because it was failing. SDTC said no when it went through the process. This is a conflict. But in emails, they said, we will help you find money from other government departments. And pretty soon after that, her company got the Sharon Center got about $10 million, $12 million from ACOA and ISET. And her other companies got $50 million from Natural Resources Canada. And then, of course, there's the Infrastructure Bank one. This is the story that we see. 9 directors, according to the Auditor General, made up those 186 conflicts. Now, that's why the CFO of the Industry Department, when the whistleblower called on him, said, and sat down with him, said, this is way bigger than the Chrétien government sponsorship scandal, which was $42 million of taxpayer money going to advertising agencies and friends of the Liberal Party. Way bigger. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. So why we're asking for the documents is every time we have a witness at committee, every time we ask a question, new information comes out. The government has opposed us at every step of the way of getting those documents, and we know why. Just the scratch of the surface by the Auditor General, which is a small part, is $390 million to Liberal insiders. That's what they're trying to hide. That's why they're opposing this production order to be turned over to the RCMP. That's why the Prime Minister's personal department, the PCO, defied the order of this House to produce these documents and ordered departments to redact all the sensitive information out. And surprisingly, they used a lot of black ink when they put those things in. They really went through a lot of toner on photocopiers when they printed this thing out because it's all blacked out. What are they hiding? What they're hiding is more malfeasance and abuse of the taxpayer money. Because we know that little bit that we've seen, 226 of 400 transactions by the Auditor General, is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, but Perkins, why are you so stressed out? According to our finance minister, it's up to the government to use our taxpayer money the way that they feel is just.
Our Canadians, wouldn't it be understandable if they were also asking themselves, are we going to get a return on that investment? You haven't just spent money on the things you're talking about. You also spent money on contracts with McKinsey last week that the Auditor General said more than half of which she could not figure out if there was value for money. She also came to the same conclusion on ArriveCan. You have grown the public sector considerably while at the same time growing the size and the scope of the number of consultants that you've hired and contracted by 88% since you came into office, the reverse of what you promised to do in 2015. Why should Canadians be sure that while they are getting this additional tax for the investments you say are necessary, they will get a return on that investment?
So I think the onus is absolutely on the government to spend Canadians' money wisely and well.
So there you have it, folks. Almost $1 billion of taxpayer money. The Liberals, they see that they're using it wisely and well with all these phony programs and transactions. But as always, that's just my opinion. I'd love to hear from you guys. What do you think about all this chaos? Hopefully we get this election sooner rather than later so we can get all of these corrupt individuals out of our government and out of our lives. But as always, I will catch you guys on the next one. Thanks so much.